before you watch a single second more, you need to know something important. Nobody has actually opened Cleopatra's sealed tomb, because nobody has ever found it. That headline you saw is not real, and no legitimate archaeological source has ever reported such a discovery. But the true story of the 20-year hunt for her missing tomb and what has already been pulled out of the ground and the sea while searching for it is honestly stranger and more fascinating than any fake headline could ever be. Stick with us, hit that like button, and subscribe, because what you're about to hear is 100% real archaeology, and it just keeps getting stranger. Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of ancient Egypt, died in 30 BC, and somewhere between that moment and today, her final resting place vanished completely from historical record. No inscription survived to mark it. No ancient map points to it. For nearly 2,000 years, Cleopatra's tomb has remained one of the biggest open mysteries in all of Egyptology, and for most of that time, almost nobody was seriously looking for it, because almost everyone assumed it was simply gone forever, swallowed by the same catastrophic geology that destroyed most of ancient Alexandria. Understanding why this mystery proved so difficult to solve requires understanding just how thoroughly the geography of ancient Alexandria has been transformed since Cleopatra's lifetime. The city Cleopatra actually walked through, ruled from, and was ultimately buried near is not simply hidden beneath the modern city that exists today. Large sections of it are literally underwater, submerged by a devastating combination of earthquakes, gradually rising sea levels, and slow geological subsidence that has been quietly swallowing the coastline for centuries, inch by inch, long before anyone alive today was born. This means archaeologists searching for Cleopatra are not just digging through sand and dust the way excavation is often portrayed in movies. In many cases, they are diving through murky seawater, searching for fragments of a lost royal capital that has been sitting on the Mediterranean sea floor for the better part of 2 millennia, a genuinely unusual and technically demanding set of circumstances that has slowed this particular investigation compared to typical land-based archaeological digs elsewhere in Egypt. That is where a Dominican lawyer turned amateur archaeologist named Kathleen Martínez enters the story. And her involvement alone sounds like something out of a movie. Martínez had no formal archaeology training when she first became obsessed with finding Cleopatra's tomb. Her fascination reportedly began after reading Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, and she became convinced that the traditional narrative surrounding Cleopatra's life, and especially her death, was missing something important. Rather than treating this as an idle hobby, Martínez left her legal career behind, moved to Egypt, and in 2004 secured an excavation license for a site most professional archaeologists had already written off as minor and unimportant. Martínez has openly acknowledged just how unlikely her own path into this field really was. In interviews, she has described herself as approaching Cleopatra's disappearance the way she once approached a legal case rather than the way a traditionally trained Egyptologist might, building a circumstantial case piece by piece rather than starting from an established academic framework. That outsider's perspective initially drew considerable skepticism from within professional archaeological circles, where credentials and institutional backing typically carry enormous weight, and where a self-funded amateur proposing to overturn decades of assumptions about Cleopatra's burial location was, understandably, not immediately taken seriously by everyone in the field. 2 decades and an extraordinary string of verified discoveries later, even many of her early skeptics now acknowledge that whatever Taposiris Magna ultimately turns out to be, it is clearly far more significant than the minor, forgettable outpost it was once assumed to be. That site is called Taposiris Magna, an ancient temple complex sitting roughly 30 miles west of Alexandria along Egypt's Mediterranean coast. For decades, mainstream Egyptology assumed Cleopatra was buried somewhere within Alexandria itself, close to the royal palace where she lived and ruled. Martínez had a different theory entirely. She proposed that Cleopatra, fearing her body would be captured by Octavian's forces and paraded through Rome as a trophy of Roman conquest, may have deliberately arranged for her burial to happen somewhere secret, somewhere far outside the city where Roman soldiers would expect to look. Almost immediately after beginning excavation at Taposiris Magna, Martínez's team found something that seemed to confirm she was onto something real. Just weeks into digging, they uncovered a small piece of blue glass, etched with inscriptions in both Greek and hieroglyphics, identifying the temple as dedicated to the goddess Isis, the deity most closely associated with Cleopatra during her reign, since Egyptian royalty were traditionally considered living extensions of the gods they served. Shortly after that discovery, the team found hundreds of bronze coins bearing Cleopatra's own face and name scattered throughout the site. A striking pattern of evidence suggesting this supposedly minor temple carried far more significance to Cleopatra's story than anyone had previously assumed, and enough to convince Martínez to commit the next 2 decades of her life to continuing the search. The discoveries kept escalating from there, year after year. Martinez's team eventually uncovered an extensive underground necropolis surrounding the temple, containing dozens of mummified remains, along with thousands of additional artifacts. Among the most tantalizing finds were 2 high-status mummies buried together, adorned with gold amulets, a level of funerary wealth typically reserved for royalty or extremely high ranking. G officials, immediately fueling speculation about exactly whose remains had been found. D. Ground-penetrating radar scans revealed an entire complex of tunnels running beneath the temple itself, with 3 separate shafts identified as potential burial locations still waiting to be fully investigated. Excavators also uncovered a headless granite statue depicting a Ptolemaic-era king, a discovery that, despite its missing head, provided further confirmation that Taposiris Magna carried far more royal significance than its modest, weathered exterior initially suggested. Over the following years, Martinez's team recovered what some researchers believe may be as many as 8 separate statues connected to Cleopatra herself, an unusually high concentration of royal imagery for a site once dismissed as a minor provincial outpost, and a pattern that steadily forced even her early skeptics to reconsider how significant the temple truly was. Coins, statues, temple dedications, and burial goods were steadily painting a picture of a location with a far deeper connection to Cleopatra's dynasty than anyone outside Martinez's team had initially been willing to consider. Political instability repeatedly threatened to derail the entire project. During periods of unrest in Egypt, excavation permits were suspended, and Martinez's team was forced to halt work entirely, sometimes for extended stretches, watching years of careful planning sit frozen while the country around them dealt with far larger concerns. Each time, once conditions stabilized, Martinez returned to Taposiris Magna and resumed digging, an act of persistence that itself became part of the story surrounding her 2-decade pursuit of a mystery most professional archaeologists considered essentially unsolvable from the very start. Then, in November of 2022, came what might be the single most dramatic discovery in the entire 20-year search. Martinez's team uncovered the entrance to a hand-carved tunnel running an astonishing 4,300 feet through solid rock. Dug roughly 2,000 years ago, using nothing but ancient tools, an engineering achievement that stunned even veteran archaeologists. The tunnel appeared to run from beneath the temple directly toward the Mediterranean Sea, suggesting that whoever built it intended it as a route connecting the sacred temple. Grounds to the coastline, and possibly to the sea itself. The scale of that tunnel becomes even more striking once you understand what it actually took to carve it, cutting more than 4,000 feet of passage through solid bedrock using only hand tools, without modern surveying equipment, without powered drilling, and while maintaining a remarkably consistent and level path over such an enormous distance, represents an extraordinary feat of ancient engineering. Oh, knee that some experts have compared in ambition and precision to the famous Eupalinos tunnel built centuries earlier on the Greek island of Samos, long considered one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. Whoever commissioned this tunnel clearly considered whatever lay at its far end important enough to justify years of grueling excavation work, carried out by teams of laborers working in cramped, poorly lit conditions far beneath the surface, a level of investment that only deepened the mystery surrounding what, or who, it was ultimately meant to protect. That tunnel discovery is what eventually led Martinez to team up with someone whose name most people instantly recognize from an entirely different field of exploration, Robert Ballard, the oceanographer famous worldwide for locating the wreck of the Titanic. Ballard and his team brought sophisticated sonar scanning and underwater mapping technology to the waters just off Magna, searching for whatever the ancient tunnel might have originally connected to beneath the waves. What they found, announced in 2025 and featured in a National Geographic documentary called Cleopatra's Final Secret, was nothing short of remarkable. Ballard's involvement in this project brought an entirely different professional skill set to a search that had, up to that point, been conducted almost exclusively on dry land. His decades of experience locating deep-sea shipwrecks using cutting-edge sonar and remote imaging technology proved directly transferable to searching for submerged ancient architecture, even though the two fields might initially seem worlds apart. In interviews about the expedition, Ballard described the partnership as a natural fit, noting that the fundamental challenge, locating something valuable and long lost beneath an enormous, dark, and largely unmapped body of water, was conceptually similar whether the target was a 20th century ocean liner resting 2.5 miles down in the North Atlantic, or 2,000-year-old harbor complex buried under a comparatively shallow stretch of the Mediterranean. Roughly 40 feet beneath the surface of the Mediterranean, Ballard's team discovered the remains of an entire sunken ancient port, complete with towering stone structures. Reaching more than 20 feet high, polished floors, columns, cement blocks, and multiple ship anchors scattered across the seafloor, along with broken amphorae, the tall ceramic jars, ancient Mediterranean cultures used to wine, oil, and other goods. This lost harbor had been completely unknown to modern archaeology until this expedition, buried beneath sand and seawater since a catastrophic earthquake and tsunami struck Alexandria in 365 AD, an event so destructive it killed an estimated 5,000 people and permanently submerged large sections of the ancient coastline under 20 feet of water. This was not the first time the sea around Alexandria had given up secrets of this scale. Back in 1992, underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio led an earlier expedition specifically to map the sunken remains of ancient Alexandria's main harbor, Portus Magnus, using electronic surveys and magnetic scanning technology to peer through the murky water and thick layers of accumulated silt. That earlier project revealed enormous submerged sections of the ancient royal quarter, including what are believed to be portions of Cleopatra's own palace complex, still sitting on the seafloor roughly 20 feet below the surface, essentially frozen in the exact moment disaster struck nearly 17 centuries ago, littered with fallen columns, statue fragments, and sphinxes that once stood proudly along the shoreline of the world's most famous ancient city. Martínez and Ballard's discovery at Taposiris Magna adds an entirely separate, submerged site to this growing underwater map of the Cleopatra-era Egyptian coastline, expanding the scope of what researchers now believe may still be waiting to be found beneath the Mediterranean. These depths must contend with poor visibility, shifting sediment that can bury a freshly exposed structure again within days, and the constant risk of damaging fragile 2,000-year-old materials that have spent centuries being gently preserved by cold, low-oxygen seawater, materials that can deteriorate rapidly and unpredictably once exposed to open air and sunlight. Every artifact brought to the surface from a site like this requires immediate, specialized conservation treatment, sometimes beginning literally within minutes of recovery, just to prevent centuries of careful natural preservation from being undone in a matter of hours. Martínez's theory, now bolstered by this underwater discovery, suggests a genuinely dramatic possible sequence of events. After Cleopatra's death, her body may have been secretly transported to Taposiris Magna, moved through the long tunnel toward Fort de Mercat coast, and carried out to this now sunken port, where it could have been laid to rest in a hidden location specifically designed to keep it permanently out of Roman hands, honoring the ancient belief, common across many cultures at the time, that even a defeated ruler's body deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, rather than displayed as a trophy of conquest. It is important to be completely honest about where this research currently stands, because responsible archaeology requires exactly that kind of honesty. Many professional Egyptologists remain skeptical of Martínez's theory, and the majority position within the field still holds that Cleopatra was most likely buried within Alexandria itself, near the royal complex, an area of the city that is itself now largely submerged and extremely difficult to excavate. No mummy, no sarcophagus, and no inscription conclusively identifying Cleopatra has been found at Taposiris Magna, despite 2 decades of dedicated, well-funded excavation. What has been found is an enormous, undeniably significant body of circumstantial evidence, a temple genuinely connected to Cleopatra's eras and imagery, an engineering marvel of a tunnel, high status, unidentified burials, and now an entire lost harbor that nobody previously knew existed. Skeptical Egyptologists raise a fair and important point when they push back on Martínez's theory. Taposiris Magna translate as roughly the Great Tomb of Osiris, a name some researchers argue may simply reflect the temple's dedication to the god Osiris, associated broadly with death and resurrection in Egyptian religious tradition, rather than pointing specifically toward any individual royal burial hidden beneath its grounds. Ancient Egyptian temples routinely incorporated symbolic references to death and the afterlife without necessarily containing an actual royal tomb. And critics argue that Martínez's interpretation may be reading more significance into the site's name and imagery than the archaeological evidence alone can fully support, a caution that experienced Egyptologists apply to virtually every site with a name carrying strong religious or mythological weight. This kind of scholarly disagreement is not a weakness in the story. It is exactly how legitimate historical debate is supposed to function, with competing interpretations tested openly against the same body of physical evidence, rather than one narrative simply being declared correct by decree. There is also the matter of Cleopatra's own historical death and burial, which ancient sources describe with frustratingly limited detail. Historical accounts generally agree that after her defeat, Cleopatra died by suicide, and that Octavian, despite having just conquered her kingdom, allowed her to be buried according to her own wishes, reportedly alongside her partner Mark Antony. Some ancient writers suggest this. Burial took place with genuine ceremonial respect, honoring the ancient world's broader cultural expectation that even a defeated ruler deserved dignity in death, a detail Martínez has repeatedly pointed to as Cleopatra's resting place was intentionally protected, rather than left exposed or destroyed by the conquering Romans, since a hastily improvised burial would have left far less physical and archaeological trace than the elaborate, carefully engineered site Martínez believes she has been slowly. But precisely where that respectful burial actually took place is exactly the detail that has eluded historians for 2,000 years, the single gap in the record that Martínez has now spent 20 years of her life trying to fill. This is exactly how real archaeological mysteries actually unfold, slowly, methodically, one carefully verified discovery, layered on top of another, rather than in the single dramatic reveal that clickbait headlines love to promise. Martínez herself has spent 20 years pursuing this specific question, funding excavation seasons, navigating political instability in Egypt that repeatedly her work, and facing considerable professional skepticism from a field that initially viewed her, a self-taught outsider without formal archaeological credentials, as an unlikely candidate to solve a mystery that had eluded professional Egyptologists for nearly 2,000 years. Funding an operation of this scale and duration has itself been an ongoing challenge throughout Martínez's career. What began as a largely self-funded personal quest gradually attracted support from both the Egyptian and Dominican governments as her accumulated, and her credibility within the field slowly grew, evidence that persistence, backed by genuine physical findings, can eventually shift even a skeptical academic community's stance, even when that persistence originates from someone working entirely outside traditional institutional channels, and without the backing any established university department might have offered from the very beginning. What makes this ongoing search genuinely compelling, beyond any exaggerated headline, is just how much has already been recovered in the process of looking, regardless of whether Taposiris Magna ultimately turns out to be Cleopatra's actual resting place. An entire sunken ancient port, a monumental hand-carved tunnel, a necropolis full of unidentified high-status burials, hundreds of coins bearing the face of one of history's most famous rulers. Even if the tomb itself remains undiscovered for another 20 years or is never found at all, the search itself has already rewritten what archaeologists understand about this stretch of Egyptian coastline and the lengths ancient people went to in order to protect what they considered sacred. It is also worth pausing to consider what discovering Cleopatra's actual tomb, if it is ever found, would genuinely mean for our understanding of history. Unlike many other famous ancient royals, Cleopatra sits at an unusually well-documented intersection of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman history, meaning any confirmed tomb would almost certainly contain not just her remains, but potentially inscriptions, grave goods, and artifacts, capable of clarifying disputed details about the final chaotic years of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last independent Egyptian kingdom before it fell permanently under Roman control. A confirmed discovery would not simply close a 2,000-year-old, it would likely open up an entirely new chapter of research into exactly how the ancient world's most famous queen was remembered, honored, and protected by the people who served her right at the exact moment her civilization's independence came to its final, irreversible end. There is something genuinely poetic about the fact that the search for Cleopatra, a ruler whose life has been endlessly mythologized, dramatized, and distorted by 2,000 years of storytelling, keeps producing real, physical, verifiable discoveries instead of a single tidy Hollywood ending. The Mediterranean has not given up her secret yet, if that secret even lies where Martínez believes it does. But every excavation season peels back another layer of a story that refuses to stay buried, and somewhere, beneath that sand and seawater, the true final chapter of Cleopatra's extraordinary life may still be waiting to be read. This is also a story about how quickly the popular understanding of history can drift away from what the actual evidence supports, especially when social media gets involved. Fabricated headlines claiming a sealed tomb has already been opened do real damage, not just because they mislead viewers, but because they quietly train audiences to expect neat, instant answers from a field where genuine discoveries almost always arrive slowly, incrementally, and wrapped in careful scientific caveats rather than dramatic certainty. The real story of Kathleen Martínez and Taposiris Magna does not need exaggeration to be compelling. 2 decades of an outsider's persistence, a series of increasingly significant physical discoveries, and a mystery that still remains genuinely, honestly unsolved is already a better story than any fabricated headline could ever manufacture. If this story fascinated you as much as it fascinated us researching it, do not scroll past without hitting that subscribe button, because there are far more real mysteries like this one still unfolding right now, with new discoveries being announced practically every single year, and each one bringing us closer to finally understanding what really happened to one of history's most legendary rulers.